This is the narration for diagram 42, Job. There's a saying somewhere that fits. I should stand with my hand on my mouth. This is such a deep explanation of suffering and of the relationship of a sufferer to God that I should have no words that even come close. I should stand with my hand on my mouth. However, here's the diagram, so we will attempt to say a few words about it. Well, what is the story of Job? It begins with Satan, a son of God, standing before the Lord. And what is his job for God? Well, it seems to be testing the faithful to make sure that their love of God is not just for themselves, which Satan implies is why anyone loves God. It's because God is so good to them. Okay, the Lord gives him permission to take away some of those blessings, which he does. And Job is crushed, but does not curse God. Instead, he professes that God alone is his Lord. So Satan comes back. You see, if you really hurt his body, then he's not going to be standing there praising you. All right, says God, you have the ability to take away his health, which is exactly what happens. And then dear Job sits in ashes with oozing sores. His wife gives up on it. Why not curse God and die? He doesn't. And he has these friends come who will try to not comfort him, but give him the reason for why these things are happening. His life before these calamities was nearly perfect. He had everything. And now there he sits in the most desperate of conditions. So, something is wrong. His life, which looked so good, is obviously hiding hidden evils. He is not the good man, because God would never allow this to happen to the perfect man. Well, let's look at the context in which this is presented to us, and this is where our diagram begins. It is really a summation of the whole Old Testament. So we begin up there with the diagram that I'm very addicted to, union with God. That is how this whole scene began before the fall of the Garden of Eden, when everything was perfection. And we are heading back to union with God. You and I want oneness with the eternal God of the universe. We want nothing between us. That is the goal of our salvation history, to be perfectly one with God. Then our timeline began with the fall. It went through the cataclysmic upheavals that come with sin and with Satan being the master. Yet God's grace follows throughout the salvation history, which is that line coming down, bending the curve, and heading toward the cross of Christ. That is the history we have just gone through. We have seen how God, reaching into this sinful world, has chosen a family, the Hebrews, and he will work with to bring the promised one, who will reunite fallen man with God, beginning with Abraham about 1900 years ago, because we're now getting close to the end of the Old Testament. Actually, the book of Job spans this whole time. There was an early story circulating among the Hebrews, even in the time of Abraham, about a godly man, Job. Didn't even seem to be a Hebrew. Nevertheless, he was tested by God and never failed. And that story, like the stories of Daniel that we saw and Noah, was something that was part of the culture of the people. So down through these ages, there has been this story circulating about Job. It has not become complete until much later, and it now is an expression of Israel's cry to God, because look, of all the things that Israel has been through, God's people. They've received the law under Moses. They have received the prophecy to the nations. They have been promised things that have not yet happened. And the fall of Jerusalem was a crusher. They were taken into exile. It seemed the end of all prophecy, but along came further so-called prophets who were really speaking in a language we've called apocalyptic eschatology, which went back to review prophecy and find the hidden meanings, because things have not worked out the way we anticipated. We've gone through then the analysis of the words of the wisdom literature, what it was all about. And in Job, we are confronted with Israel, or Job, having done everything in its power to please God, only to be brought to rack and ruin. Why? Well, there has to be a reason. And the people who love these little maxims and these little proverbs and these little sayings are there to explain to Job that he has obviously transgressed the Lord's laws, or he wouldn't be suffering, because suffering comes with disobedience. Hasn't it been taught them since Moses that if you do right, you will be blessed; if you do wrong, you will be cursed? Look at you sitting there in your ashes, Job, and claiming to have done nothing wrong. Well, we can see that that's not true. Now, Eliphaz the first starts out in a somewhat subdued, more tender, even a benevolent way with Job. But as Job continues to say, I'm not guilty, I have done nothing, I am upright, I am righteous, those words become less tender and become much more vehement, until finally one of these so-called friends is practically yelling at him. You're not telling the truth. You are hiding some vicious sin. For God would not pay this kind of attention to you if you weren't an evil person. So these old questions arise in all of these contemplations between Job and his friends. After all, who is man, and why is his life worth anything to God? What makes his life really beneficial to himself or for others? What good has it been that he's been so merciful? Has the world been made any better because of his mercy? Doesn't look like it. Why does God pay attention to this worm called man? And who is God who calls this love? These are all the questions that are rampant through the book of Job. Can they be answered? Can these questions be answered by wise sayings? Vanity, vanity, that sounds like Ecclesiastes. And in a way, Job's life looks like it is a fulfillment of Ecclesiastes. This is vanity. So who's the complainer here? Well, it's Israel. They're the chosen people. But all that's happened is suffering. It can't be meaningless. But there doesn't seem to be much glint of light. Now in Maccabees, we at least had the assurance that there would be life after death. There doesn't seem to be that here. It just is a riddle. But now look at your diagram. Who is doing the questioning? Well, it's Job. And he's the perfect Old Testament man, but he's ending up in the center of his universe. And under this test that Satan brings, Job accuses God. He's unfair to me. I'm innocent. I hate my life. I long to die. God is wrong. There is no rhyme or reason. I'm helpless. I'm hopeless. Yet in all things he clings to God, even if he slays me. This is the lament and the trust of Israel in God, despite the unanswered questions that are arising. So, what is the problem here? It is that if a man lives entirely by the law, does nothing wrong, and comes along this line of the Old Testament, doing just as God wills, that he is still going to bump into problems, and he is still going to be tested, and then will appear the real problem with living a perfect life. The perfect life puts a human being, a man, in the center of the universe, questioning God, unable to take a place out with the rest of mankind, on the periphery of everything, but only in the center, because he is unable to get away from pride. And can this man, who has nothing to confess to God about any wickedness, can he stand in the center of the universe and question God? Do you see that white circle? Who belongs in the center of the universe? This human being who is perfectly attuned to God and has done his will all his life, and there's not a single stroke against him, can only stand there in the center of the universe accusing God. Can this possibly bring Job into union with God? That is the goal of salvation history. How far away he is from that. And that's why our timeline has come down and across the bottom away from union with God. Because though Israel is learning its lessons, God is working with it through history. We've seen through all of the trials of under the various kings of the ancient world, all of the sufferings that Israel has gone through, its great hopes after the exile that have gone smashing down. And here it is at the end of the Old Testament, having produced what? A perfection, a perfect man, who can't possibly be one with God because he's so proud. He is a self-made man. He cannot become one with God. Not in that state. So how is this conundrum going to be solved? Elihu, the last of the friends, and actually he seems to be an outsider, comes on the scene, and in a couple of little verses, he gives a clue about how this can be resolved. God will, he says in two kind of offhanded remarks, provide a ransom. Ooh, a ransom. Job has to be ransomed. The people of Israel, who have tried to live perfectly the law, must be ransomed. Someone, God, must come in and pay a price to snatch them away from their pride, their arrogance, their center of the universe, and set them out on the periphery of the universe where they belong, and God alone is in the center. But, says Elihu, be careful. The price of that ransom will be so great that you may refuse it. Heaven help us. The price of our ransom is going to be that cross, and the one who hangs on it. We will throw ourselves at the foot of that cross and beg for mercy. Our pride will be washed away. The ransom will have been paid, and God will lift us up to union with Him. That is what lies behind this amazing revelation of Job, and of course it culminates in his actual theophany. God comes and speaks to him, and he says, put away all your questions, Job. Gird yourself up and stand there like a man, and I will question you. The God of the universe is now in the place he belongs, and you, Job, are just one of the many on the periphery, and God will ask you, can you answer this, Job? Can you explain the universe and all that I have done? You can't even tell me about the crocodile or the hippopotamus, and I am the creator of those things as much as everything else in this universe. You are now where you belong, and the ransom will be paid so that you and I will be one. So in the suffering, in the prayer, it cannot be meaningless. There is a glint of light, and that light is the theophany of God. We are far beyond the Old Testament's imagination, and the ransom has been paid so that we may have the God encounter.